She called me the family disappointment at dinner right after I told everyone I had left my corporate job, laughing with my aunt about how I would never amount to anything while passing the mashed potatoes. 3 weeks later, I was reviewing investment applications at the venture capital firm I had co-founded when I saw her boss's name on a $2 million funding request that required my signature to approve. My cousin Sienna took another sip of wine, her perfectly manicured hand resting on the table as she exchanged knowing glances with Aunt Vera. The entire extended family sat around my parents' dining room table, 23 people who had gathered to celebrate my grandmother's 80th birthday. Sienna had waited until everyone was quiet, until all eyes were on me as I finished explaining my career transition. "So, let me get this straight," she said, her voice dripping with theatrical concern. "You quit your job at Henderson & Associates to start some little business venture with your friends? Do you even have clients yet?" The table fell silent except for Aunt Vera's sharp laugh. "Honey, this is exactly what I was worried about with Ivy. Always chasing these unrealistic dreams instead of being grateful for stability." Sienna's smile widened as she reached for the mashed potatoes, passing them to our grandmother without breaking eye contact with me. "Some people just aren't cut out for the real world, I suppose." I watched my mother's face flush with embarrassment, my father suddenly fascinated by his dinner plate. My younger sister reached under the table to squeeze my hand in silent support but said nothing. Sienna continued, emboldened by the silence. "I mean, I'm not trying to be cruel, I'm just being realistic. Ivy's always been the creative type, right? Artsy. Not really business-minded like some of us," she gestured to herself, her Brooks Brothers blazer a pointed contrast to my casual sweater. "That's why I've stayed at Garrison Tech for 6 years. Stability, loyalty. Those things matter in the professional world." She turned to address the table broadly now, playing to her audience. "Graham, my boss, just promoted me to senior project manager last month. He says I'm indispensable to the company's growth strategy. Some of us understand the value of commitment." I set down my fork carefully, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. What Sienna didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that my little business venture was Meridian Ventures, a venture capital firm I had co-founded with 2 former colleagues who brought 15 years of combined investment banking experience. We had quietly closed our first fund at $48 million 3 weeks ago, with backing from some of the most respected institutional investors in the region. Growing up, Sienna and I had been close. She was 2 years older, the golden child who excelled at everything she touched. Straight A's, captain of the debate team, early acceptance to a prestigious university. I was the quieter one, the reader, the girl who spent weekends sketching in notebooks instead of networking at country club events. Our family operated on a clear hierarchy of value, and Sienna occupied the throne while I lingered somewhere in the middle tier, acceptable, but unremarkable. The divide deepened when we both entered the workforce. Sienna landed at Garrison Tech straight out of college, a mid-sized software company that had positioned itself well in the enterprise solutions market. She climbed steadily, each promotion announced with fanfare at family gatherings. Meanwhile, I had spent 7 years at Henderson & Associates, one of the city's top consulting firms, quietly building expertise in strategic operations and business development. Nobody in my family really understood what I did there, and I had learned not to bother explaining. My decision to leave Henderson had been 18 months in the making. I had connected with Callum and Rowan, 2 brilliant analysts who shared my frustration with the limitations of traditional corporate structures. We spent late evenings and weekends developing our investment thesis, researching market gaps, building financial models. When we finally made our move, creating Meridian Ventures to focus on emerging technology companies with sustainable growth potential, I had been terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. The first year was brutal. We worked from Callum's spare bedroom, living off savings and the small angel investments we had secured from a handful of trusted former clients. We reviewed hundreds of pitch decks, conducted countless due diligence meetings, slowly building our reputation in the startup ecosystem. The breakthrough came when we identified a pattern others had missed: a cluster of industrial automation companies that were revolutionizing manufacturing processes, but struggling to scale due to lack of strategic capital and operational expertise. We placed our first major bet on a company called Precision Dynamics, providing not just funding, but hands-on operational support. 6 months later, Precision Dynamics announced a partnership with a Fortune 500 manufacturer, validating both their technology and our investment approach. That success opened doors. Within 9 months, we had raised our first formal fund from institutional limited partners who were impressed by our track record and differentiated strategy. By the time of my grandmother's birthday dinner, Meridian Ventures had deployed capital into 8 companies, with 3 already showing strong revenue growth and 2 positioned for acquisition discussions. But I had kept all of this quiet from my family, partially because I wanted to prove the concept before making announcements. Partially because I knew the reception would be skeptical at best, dismissive at worst. I had underestimated how vicious that dismissal would be. Sienna's performance at dinner revealed something darker than mere competitiveness. She had savored my humiliation, weaponizing my career choice to elevate herself in front of our entire extended family. And Aunt Vera had been her eager accomplice, the 2 of them transforming my vulnerability into entertainment. The dinner had continued with forced normalcy after Sienna's attack. Dessert was served, presents were opened. Through it all, I maintained a calm exterior while rage crystallized in my chest. Not the hot, reactive anger that fades quickly, but something colder and more deliberate. When I finally excused myself early, claiming a headache, nobody seemed surprised. The family disappointment, leaving early again. Probably going home to watch Netflix and browse job listings. The drive home had given me time to process, to recognize that this wasn't just about one cruel comment at one dinner. This was the culmination of years of Sienna positioning herself above me, using my family's narrow definition of success to diminish my worth. And I had enabled it by staying silent, by not asserting my own accomplishments, by accepting their framework for measuring value. 3 weeks later, I was in my office at Meridian Ventures reviewing the week's incoming funding applications when Graham Reynolds' name appeared on my screen. Garrison Tech was requesting a Series B funding round of $2 million to scale their enterprise platform and expand into new markets. The application was thorough, professionally prepared, detailing the company's growth trajectory and strategic vision. As I read through the materials, I recognized Sienna's fingerprints throughout the presentation. Her project management expertise had clearly shaped their operational roadmap. Her name appeared multiple times in the organizational chart and team bios. This was her domain, her territory, the source of her professional identity, and it required my signature to proceed. The irony was exquisite. Here was Sienna's boss, the man she had publicly cited as validation of her career success, coming to the family disappointment with hat in hand, asking for capital that would determine his company's future. Our investment committee would review the application in 2 days. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. The mashed potatoes, the theatrical concern, the public humiliation. Some people just aren't cut out for the real world, I suppose. Sienna had made a calculation that night. She had assessed the room, identified an opportunity to elevate herself at my expense, and executed with precision. What she hadn't calculated was the possibility that I held any real power, any actual influence beyond my little business venture. She had fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what I had built. That miscalculation was about to become very, very expensive, not just for Graham Reynolds and Garrison Tech, but for Sienna's entire carefully constructed narrative about success, stability, and indispensability. I picked up my phone and texted Callum and Rowan. Interesting application just came in. Think we should schedule the full due diligence review for this one. I have some questions about operational sustainability and leadership depth. The response came within seconds. Callum, which company? I typed back. Garrison Tech, the one where my cousin works. Rowan's reply appeared immediately after. Oh, this is going to be good. I set the phone down and returned to reviewing the application, making careful notes in the margins. Questions about market positioning, concerns about competitive differentiation, observations about management structure that would require deeper investigation, all legitimate business considerations, all completely defensible as standard investment committee scrutiny, and all guaranteed to make Graham Reynolds very, very nervous about whether his funding would materialize. Sienna thought she knew what power looked like. She measured it in promotions and titles, in the approval of bosses and the envy of peers. She had wielded that power against me with confidence, secure in her position at the top of the family hierarchy. She was about to discover a different kind of power. The kind that doesn't announce itself at family dinners. The kind that doesn't need validation from aunts and cousins. The kind that signs checks and makes decisions and shapes futures with a single word, approved or denied. I pulled up Sienna's LinkedIn profile, scrolling through her recent posts celebrating Garrison Tech's growth and her role in the company's success. Her most recent update, posted just yesterday. Thrilled to be leading our expansion strategy as we enter this exciting new growth phase. Big things coming for Garrison Tech. I took a screenshot, saving it to a folder on my desktop labeled simply Due Diligence. Then I drafted an email to Graham Reynolds' assistant, requesting a preliminary call to discuss his funding application. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I composed the closing line. I look forward to learning more about Garrison Tech's operational capabilities and leadership team depth. Please have Mr. Reynolds prepared to discuss his succession planning and key person dependencies. Send. The preliminary call with Graham Reynolds was scheduled for Friday afternoon. I spent the intervening days conducting research that went far beyond standard investment due diligence. I wanted to understand not just Garrison Tech's financials, but the entire ecosystem that supported Sienna's professional identity. What I discovered was fascinating. Garrison Tech had positioned itself well in the enterprise software market, but their growth had plateaued over the past 18 months. Revenue was flat. Customer acquisition costs were rising. Their flagship product was facing increased competition from newer, more agile startups. Graham's funding request wasn't about expansion. It was about survival. They needed capital to modernize their platform before their existing client base started looking elsewhere. The company's organizational structure revealed another vulnerability. Sienna's role as senior project manager made her responsible for coordinating between product development, sales, and client services. On paper, this looked impressive. In practice, it meant she was the critical dependency point for nearly every major initiative. If Sienna failed, projects stalled. If Sienna succeeded, Graham took the credit. She had built herself into an irreplaceable position, which gave her job security but also made her a single point of failure. I shared my research with Callum and Rowan during our Wednesday partnership meeting. Garrison Tech is over-leveraged on key personnel, I explained, pulling up organizational charts on the conference room screen. They've concentrated too much operational knowledge in individuals rather than building scalable systems. That's a red flag for any growth stage company. Rowan studied the charts, his analyst brain immediately identifying the weak points. Your cousin is the connective tissue holding their operations together, but there's no documentation of her processes, no succession plan if she leaves. This is exactly the kind of operational risk we usually pass on. Usually, Callum repeated, glancing at me with a knowing expression. But not always. Sometimes companies with operational challenges can be excellent investments if they're willing to make structural changes. I nodded slowly. Exactly. If Graham wants our capital, he'll need to demonstrate commitment to building sustainable systems. That means reducing key person dependencies, distributing knowledge, creating redundancies, which would effectively reduce your cousin's importance to the organization, Rowan observed. Her importance? I corrected. Or her leverage? There's a difference between being valuable and being irreplaceable. One serves the company, the other serves the individual. The Friday call with Graham was revealing in ways he didn't intend. He was polished and professional, walking me through Garrison Tech's growth strategy with the confidence of someone who had delivered this pitch dozens of times. But when I started asking about operational sustainability, his answers became vague. So your Series B capital is primarily allocated to product development and sales expansion, I said, reviewing his slide deck. But I'm not seeing investment in operational infrastructure. How are you planning to scale delivery with your current team structure? Graham hesitated just a fraction too long. We have excellent people in place. Sienna Moore, our senior project manager, has built incredibly efficient processes. Efficient processes that are documented and transferable? I pressed. Or efficient processes that exist primarily in one person's head? Another pause. Sienna is exceptionally talented. We rely on her expertise. Reliance creates vulnerability, I said pleasantly. What happens if Sienna gets recruited away, or decides to start her own consulting firm, or simply burns out from being the linchpin of too many critical projects? Graham's discomfort was palpable even over the phone. We've discussed succession planning, but frankly, Sienna's institutional knowledge is difficult to replicate. Then you don't have succession planning, I replied. You have hope. and hope isn't an investment thesis. The call ended with Graham promising to provide additional documentation about their operational roadmap. I knew he wouldn't have satisfactory answers. Companies like Garrison Tech operated on momentum and individual heroics until the momentum stopped and the heroes got tired. They hadn't built for sustainability because sustainability was boring compared to quarterly growth targets. What Graham didn't know was that I had already made my decision about Garrison Tech's funding. But the decision wasn't simple approval or denial. It was something far more surgical. That evening, my phone rang. Sienna. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message with growing satisfaction. Ivy, hi, it's me. Her voice was strained, trying for casual, but landing somewhere near anxious. Listen, I heard through Graham that you're reviewing our funding application. I just wanted to reach out and, make sure there weren't any misunderstandings or anything. Keep it in the family. Call me back when you get a chance. I deleted the message without responding. The next call came Sunday morning. Aunt Vera this time, her tone saccharine and false. Ivy, sweetheart, your mother mentioned you're working in venture capital now. How wonderful. Sienna just told me about the coincidence with her company's funding request. Small world, isn't it? I'm sure you'll do what's right for family. I let that one go to voicemail too. By Monday, the desperation was setting in. 3 more calls from Sienna, each one a little less composed than the last. A text from my mother. Sienna says you're not returning her calls. Is everything all right? And an email from Graham's assistant, requesting an urgent follow-up meeting to address any concerns about the application. I scheduled the follow-up for Wednesday, 2 weeks after my grandmother's birthday dinner. 2 weeks after Sienna had called me the family disappointment while passing the mashed potatoes. Tuesday evening, Sienna appeared at my apartment. I watched through the security camera as she paced in the lobby, clearly debating whether to buzz up. Finally, she pressed the intercom. Ivy, it's Sienna. Can we talk, please? I pressed the button. About what? About Garrison Tech. About the funding. About... She stopped, regrouping. Can I just come up? This is important. I'm sure it is, I said. Unfortunately, I have a policy about not discussing active investment applications outside of official channels. You understand. Professional boundaries. The silence stretched long enough that I thought she might have left. Then, Ivy, come on. We're family. Are we? I let the question hang in the air. I wasn't sure after that lovely speech at Grandma's party. The one about how I'm not cut out for the real world. Or was it about my unrealistic dreams? I forget the exact wording. I didn't mean... She struggled, finally landing on, I was out of line. I'm sorry. Can we please talk about this face-to-face? Wednesday at 2, I said. Graham has a meeting with our investment committee. You're welcome to attend as a member of his leadership team. Professional capacity only. I released the intercom button before she could respond. The Garrison Tech funding review consumed the next 48 hours in ways that were both professionally justified and personally satisfying. Callum took point on the financial analysis, while Rowan dove deep into their technical infrastructure and competitive positioning. My role was operational due diligence, which meant scrutinizing exactly how they delivered value to clients and whether those delivery mechanisms could scale. I requested documentation that most investment committees wouldn't bother with. Project management workflows, client onboarding processes, internal communication protocols, escalation procedures for when projects went off track. All the unglamorous operational details that determined whether a company could grow sustainably or would collapse under its own weight. Graham's team scrambled to produce what I'd requested, which revealed the first major problem. There was no centralized documentation. Everything existed in a chaotic mixture of shared drives, individual hard drives, email threads, and institutional memory. When I asked for the standard operating procedure for their most common client implementation, I received 17 different documents that contradicted each other in fundamental ways. This is concerning, I wrote in my assessment memo to Callum and Rowan. They have no operational source of truth. Every project manager is apparently inventing their own methodology. That might work when you have 3 clients, but it becomes catastrophic at scale. The deeper I dug, the clearer Sienna's role became. She wasn't just the senior project manager, she was the operational translator. When sales overpromised to clients, Sienna figured out how to deliver. When product development couldn't meet deadlines, Sienna renegotiated expectations. When different departments couldn't communicate effectively, Sienna served as the intermediary. She had made herself indispensable by becoming the only person who understood how all the broken pieces fit together. It was impressive in its way. She had identified a critical gap and filled it, creating job security through irreplaceability. But from an investment perspective, it was a disaster. No company could scale if their operations depended on one person performing translation services between dysfunctional departments. Wednesday morning arrived with rain hammering against my office windows. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit from the same designer Sienna favored, wanting her to recognize that we operated in the same professional sphere now. The balance of power had shifted, and presentation mattered. The investment committee meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in our main conference room. Graham arrived 15 minutes early with Sienna in tow. She looked polished and professional, her armor firmly in place, but I caught the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped her portfolio just a bit too tightly. Ivy. Graham extended his hand with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Thank you for making time for this follow-up. I think you'll be impressed by what we've pulled together. I'm looking forward to it, I replied, shaking his hand before turning to Sienna with deliberate politeness. Sienna, good to see you in a professional capacity. She flinched almost imperceptibly at the emphasis. Good to see you too. Callum and Rowan joined us, and we settled around the conference table. Graham launched into his presentation, highlighting Garrison Tech's market position, growth potential, and strategic vision. He was good at this, I had to admit. He painted a compelling picture of a company poised for breakout success, if only they had the capital to execute. But when he finished and opened the floor for questions, the tone shifted. Rowan started with technical concerns. Your platform architecture is built on legacy frameworks that are increasingly difficult to maintain. Your own documentation notes that you're accumulating technical debt faster than you can pay it down. How does that reconcile with your claims about scalability? Graham deflected smoothly, talking about planned modernization efforts and architectural improvements. But his answers were vague on timelines and specific technical approaches. Callum followed with financial questions that exposed uncomfortable truths about their customer concentration and revenue stability. 72% of your revenue comes from your top 5 clients. That's extremely high concentration risk. If even one of those clients churns, your growth projections collapse. Again, Graham had responses prepared, but they sounded increasingly like justifications rather than solutions. Then it was my turn. Let's talk about operational capacity, I said, pulling up the organizational chart on the screen. Your funding request assumes you'll triple your client base over the next 18 months, but your current delivery model doesn't scale linearly. Each new client requires significant project management oversight and customization. How are you planning to handle that increased load? We're hiring, Graham said. The funding includes budget for expanding our project management team. Hiring solves the headcount problem, I agreed, but it doesn't solve the knowledge transfer problem. Your processes are undocumented. Your methodologies are inconsistent. Your operational expertise is concentrated in individuals rather than systems. I gestured to Sienna. Take your senior project manager, for example. Based on the documentation I reviewed, Sienna personally oversees or coordinates every major client engagement. That's not a sustainable model. Sienna's face had gone pale. She started to speak, but Graham cut her off. Sienna has been instrumental in our success, he said firmly. Her expertise is one of our competitive advantages. Her expertise is one of your existential risks, I corrected. What happens when she takes vacation, or gets sick, or receives a better offer from a competitor? You've built your operations around dependency on specific individuals instead of creating systems that can function independently. That's the opposite of what we look for in a scalable business. The room fell silent. Graham exchanged a glance with Sienna, and I could see the calculation happening in real time. They had walked into this meeting thinking they were pitching for capital. They were beginning to realize they were defending their entire operational approach. So, what are you saying? Graham asked carefully. That you won't fund us because we have talented people? I'm saying we won't fund you unless you commit to building sustainable operations, I replied. If you want Meridian's capital, here are the conditions. First, complete documentation of all core processes within 90 days. Second, implementation of a project management system that removes individual dependencies. Third, reorganization of your delivery team to create redundancy and knowledge distribution. Fourth, development of a legitimate succession plan for all critical roles. I paused, letting the implications sink in. These aren't suggestions. They're requirements. If you can't demonstrate commitment to operational maturity, we'll pass on the investment. Sienna found her voice finally. You're asking us to completely restructure how we work. I'm asking you to work like a company that deserves $2 million in institutional capital, I said evenly. Right now, you work like a consulting firm that happens to sell software. That might have gotten you this far, but it won't get you where you claim you want to go. Graham cleared his throat. These changes would take months to implement. Our growth timeline depends on accessing this capital within the next quarter. Then you have a decision to make, I said. Fast money with no operational improvements, which means finding different investors who don't care about sustainability. Or strategic capital that comes with requirements for building a business that can actually scale. We're offering the second option. Take it or leave it. The meeting concluded with Graham promising to discuss my conditions with his board and get back to us within a week. As they gathered their materials, Sienna caught my eye across the table. The pleading look she gave me was so different from her triumphant smirk at the dinner table that I almost laughed. Almost. After they left, Callum leaned back in his chair with an appreciative whistle. That was brutal. Completely justified from an investment standpoint, but brutal. She built her entire professional identity on being irreplaceable, I said, closing my laptop. We just explained in detail why irreplaceability is a liability, not an asset, in front of her boss. On the record. Rowan was studying me carefully. You know Graham is going to make her the scapegoat if they don't get the funding, right? Or if they do get it and have to restructure. Either way, her position just became extremely vulnerable. Then she should have built systems instead of kingdoms, I replied. That's not our problem to solve. My phone buzzed with a text from Sienna. Can we please talk privately? This isn't fair. I showed the message to Callum and Rowan. Thoughts? Document everything, Callum advised. If she tries to claim this is personal rather than professional, you need a paper trail showing business justification for every decision. I typed back, all investment discussions must go through official channels. Please direct any questions to Graham's assistant to schedule appropriate follow-up meetings. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, you're destroying my career over one dinner comment. That's insane. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the text to our attorney with a note. Documenting potential claims of bias in investment decision-making. Please review and advise. Because Sienna still didn't understand. This wasn't about one comment. It was about a lifetime of treating me as lesser, of using family gatherings as opportunities to elevate herself at my expense, of building her confidence on the foundation of my supposed inadequacy. She had made a calculation at that dinner table. She had assessed the room and decided that humiliating me would strengthen her position in the family hierarchy. What she hadn't calculated was the possibility that I had built real power in a domain she didn't even know to measure. That miscalculation was about to become career-ending. Graham's response came exactly 7 days later, delivered via email at 4:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. I was in the office late, reviewing quarterly reports from our portfolio companies, when the notification appeared on my screen. Subject line, Garrison Tech Series B, Investment, Revised Proposal. I opened it slowly, savoring the moment. The email was formal and carefully worded, but the desperation bled through in the details. Graham accepted all of my conditions. Complete process documentation within 90 days. Implementation of scalable project management systems. Reorganization of the delivery team to eliminate single points of failure. Development of succession plans for all critical roles. But there was more. In exchange for accepting these operational requirements, Graham requested a slight modification to the investment terms. He wanted the $2 million dispersed in tranches tied to completion of the operational improvements rather than as a lump sum. This would give Garrison Tech immediate capital to address their most pressing needs while creating accountability for the structural changes. It was a reasonable counteroffer. Professionally, I should have been pleased that Graham was taking the operational concerns seriously and proposing a framework that aligned incentives. Instead, I saw the trap Sienna had walked herself into. The tranche structure meant that Garrison Tech's future funding depended entirely on successful completion of the very operational improvements that would dismantle Sienna's irreplaceable position. She would be required to document all her processes, making her tacit knowledge explicit and transferable. She would need to train others to do her job, eliminating her status as the only person who understood how everything worked. She would have to participate in creating the systems that would make her replaceable, and she would have to do it knowing that I was the one evaluating whether those improvements were sufficient to release the next tranche of funding. I drafted a response to Graham, keeping it professional and brief. The proposed tranche structure is acceptable to Meridian Ventures. We'll need detailed milestones for each operational improvement, with specific deliverables and timelines. Please submit a revised implementation plan within 2 weeks. Then I called Callum and Rowan into my office to discuss next steps. Graham took the deal, I said, forwarding them the email. He's proposing a tranche structure tied to operational milestones. Rowan scanned the email quickly. Smart move on his part. Reduces his risk of taking money with strings attached that prove impossible to satisfy. And creates a roadmap for dismantling your cousin's operational monopoly, Callum added. She's going to have to document herself out of a job. Not out of a job, I corrected. Out of leverage. There's a difference. Garrison Tech will probably still need skilled project managers after this reorganization. They just won't need Sienna specifically. She'll become replaceable, fungible, just another employee instead of an indispensable linchpin. That's arguably worse than being fired, Rowan observed. Getting fired can be spun as bad luck or personality conflict. Becoming irrelevant is much harder to explain to future employers. The implementation plan arrived 12 days later, running to 47 pages of detailed milestones, deliverables, and timelines. Graham had clearly invested serious effort into this, probably with expensive consulting support. The plan was comprehensive and realistic, acknowledging the scope of changes required while providing a framework for executing them systematically. I reviewed every page with meticulous attention, making notes and identifying areas that needed clarification. Then I scheduled a kickoff meeting for the following week to officially launch the Operational Improvement Initiative. The meeting was held at Garrison Tech's offices, a modern space in the business district that projected exactly the right mixture of established credibility and innovative energy. Graham had assembled his core leadership team, including Sienna, his VP of Engineering, his head of sales, and his CFO. I arrived with Callum, who would be monitoring the financial aspects of the improvements, and a new addition to our team, Paige, an operational consultant we had brought in specifically to oversee the Garrison Tech engagement. Paige had spent 15 years building scalable operations for fast-growth technology companies. She knew exactly what good looked like, and she didn't have any tolerance for mediocrity or excuses. Let's be clear about what we're doing here, I said after introductions were complete. This isn't about checking boxes or creating documentation that sits on a shelf. We're rebuilding your operations from the ground up, creating systems that can support sustainable growth. That means hard decisions, difficult conversations, and significant changes to how people work. I looked directly at Sienna. It also means letting go of the hero mentality. No more one person saving the day. No more tribal knowledge that exists only in someone's head. Everything gets documented, everything gets systematized, everything becomes transferable. Sienna's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Paige took over, walking through the implementation timeline. The first 90 days would focus on documentation and analysis. Every core process would be mapped, inefficiencies identified, dependencies flagged. The next 90 days would be spent redesigning those processes to eliminate bottlenecks and create redundancy. The final 90 days would be implementation and training, ensuring the new systems actually worked in practice. Who will be leading the documentation effort? The VP of Engineering asked. That's the interesting part, Paige said with a slight smile. The people who currently own these processes need to be the ones documenting them. They have the knowledge. They understand the nuances. They're best positioned to ensure nothing gets lost in translation. She pulled up an organizational chart. Sienna, you'll be leading the project management process documentation, working with your team to capture everything about how client engagements are currently managed. We'll need workflows, decision trees, escalation procedures, quality checkpoints, everything. It was perfect. Sienna would have to spend the next 3 months systematically transferring all her operational expertise into documented formats that anyone could follow. She would be creating the instruction manual for her own replacement. How detailed do these documentation efforts need to be? Sienna asked, her voice carefully controlled. Detailed enough that someone with basic project management experience could follow them successfully, Paige replied. Think of it as writing a cookbook. If you just write "make the sauce," that's not helpful. But if you specify exact measurements, temperatures, timing, and techniques, someone can recreate your results. The meeting continued for another hour, establishing governance structures, communication protocols, and accountability mechanisms. Every 30 days, Garrison Tech would submit progress reports to Meridian Ventures. Every 60 days, we would conduct on-site reviews to assess advancement. And every 90 days, we would evaluate whether the operational improvements justified releasing the next tranche of capital. As the meeting wrapped up, Graham pulled me aside. I appreciate Meridian's commitment to this process, he said quietly. But I need to be honest with you. Some of my team are concerned that these operational improvements are really about reducing costs, so we can eliminate headcount later. I considered the question carefully. The operational improvements are about creating a sustainable business model. What you do with that model is up to you. Maybe you decide to grow faster with the same team. Maybe you decide to maintain the same growth rate with fewer dependencies on key personnel. Those are strategic decisions for you and your board. And Meridian's perspective on those strategic decisions? We care about return on investment, I said bluntly. We need Garrison Tech to grow sustainably and eventually provide an exit opportunity for our fund. Whether you achieve that through expansion, optimization, or some combination of both, that's your call to make. Graham nodded slowly, processing this. Sienna is worried her job is at risk. Then Sienna should focus on demonstrating value beyond being the only person who knows how things work, I replied. The employees who thrive in scaling companies are the ones who build systems instead of empires. I left the office feeling a familiar satisfaction that had nothing to do with investment returns, and everything to do with watching carefully laid plans come together. Sienna had spent years building her professional identity on being irreplaceable. Now she would spend the next 9 months systematically dismantling that irreplaceability with her own hands under my supervision. That evening, my phone rang. My mother. Ivy, we need to talk about Sienna. Her voice was strained. She came over today in tears. She says you're making her job impossible, that you're punishing her for what happened at Grandma's party. I'm doing my job as an investor, I replied calmly. Garrison Tech has operational weaknesses that need to be addressed before we can justify deploying capital. Those weaknesses have nothing to do with family dynamics. But you're requiring her to document all her work processes so they can replace her. She's terrified of losing her job. If documenting her work makes her replaceable, then her value to the company was based on opacity rather than expertise. That's a Sienna problem, not an Ivy problem. Silence stretched across the line. Then, when did you become so cold? Around the time my cousin called me the family disappointment in front of 23 relatives and nobody said a word in my defense, I replied. I'm not being cold, Mom. I'm being professional. There's a difference. She's family, Ivy. Then maybe family should have acted like it when she was publicly humiliating me over the mashed potatoes. I paused, letting that sink in. I have to go. I have a portfolio review meeting in the morning. I hung up before she could respond. The next 9 months were going to be very interesting. The first 90-day progress review revealed exactly what I had anticipated: resistance disguised as compliance. Garrison Tech had produced documentation, but it was superficial and incomplete. Process maps that skipped critical decision points. Workflows that assumed tribal knowledge rather than explaining it. Quality standards that were vague and subjective rather than measurable and objective. Paige tore through their deliverables with surgical precision during the review meeting. This isn't documentation, she said, holding up a printout of their project management workflow. This is creative writing. Assess client needs and develop appropriate solution. What does that mean? Who assesses? Using what criteria? What makes a solution appropriate? Where are the decision trees, the evaluation frameworks, the approval processes? Graham shifted uncomfortably. We wanted to preserve flexibility in how we approach different client situations. Flexibility is fine, Paige countered, but flexibility without structure is just chaos. You can have customization within a framework, but first you need the framework. I let Paige run the operational critique while I focused on the strategic implications. Here's what concerns me, I said, pulling up the progress tracking dashboard. You're 3 months into a 9-month operational improvement program, and you've delivered maybe 15% of what was promised. At this rate, you won't complete the required changes within the timeline, which means you won't receive the second tranche of funding, which means you'll run out of runway before you can scale. The CFO cleared his throat. We've been balancing operational improvements with ongoing client delivery. It's challenging to do both simultaneously. That's exactly the problem you were supposed to solve, I replied. Your operations are so person-dependent that you can't spare anyone to work on improvement because everyone is constantly firefighting. That's not a resource constraint. That's a structural failure. Sienna had been quiet throughout the meeting, her face carefully neutral. But when I turned my attention directly to her, the facade cracked slightly. Sienna, you were responsible for leading the project management documentation effort. Based on what was delivered, it's clear that either you didn't invest sufficient time in this, or you deliberately kept the documentation vague to preserve your status as the knowledge expert. Which is it? Her eyes flashed with anger before she controlled it. I documented everything I do. If it's not detailed enough, maybe the real issue is that project management is more complex than your consultant understands. Or maybe, Paige interjected smoothly, project management is exactly as complex as I understand, and you've been papering over operational gaps with personal heroics for so long that you've forgotten what good process actually looks like. The tension in the room crystallized. Graham looked between us, calculating. This was the moment where he had to choose. Defend Sienna and risk losing the funding, or support the operational improvements and sacrifice his indispensable project manager. We'll redo the documentation, he said finally. Paige, can you work directly with Sienna's team to ensure we're capturing the right level of detail? It was a political answer, but it moved in the right direction. Paige would now have direct access to Sienna's processes, able to see exactly how things really worked, rather than relying on Sienna's sanitized version. The next 60 days were fascinating to watch. Paige embedded herself in Garrison Tech's operations, shadowing project managers, interviewing team members, and methodically mapping how work actually flowed versus how it was supposed to flow. What she discovered was both impressive and damning. Sienna had indeed built an efficient operation, but it was efficient precisely because she personally intervened in every single engagement at multiple critical junctures. When sales overpromised, Sienna negotiated. When engineering underdelivered, Sienna managed expectations. When clients had issues, Sienna smoothed them over. She had created a system that worked beautifully as long as she was the central hub routing all information and making all decisions. The problem was that this model broke completely when scaled. Sienna couldn't personally intervene in 50 client engagements the way she did in 15. The operational bottleneck wasn't process or people. It was Sienna herself. Paige's report to Meridian Ventures was devastating in its professional politeness. Garrison Tech has built their delivery model around the capabilities of a single exceptional individual. This has created short-term success but long-term fragility. To scale, they need to transition from a hub-and-spoke model centered on Sienna to a distributed model where teams can operate independently using shared frameworks. The recommendation was clear. Reorganize the project management function, create autonomous delivery teams, and redistribute Sienna's responsibilities across multiple leads. In other words, eliminate the very structure that made Sienna indispensable. I called Graham to discuss the findings before the formal review meeting. You have a decision to make, I told him. You can keep your current structure, which means staying small and dependent on key personnel. Or you can restructure, which means making some difficult people decisions but positioning yourself for real growth. Sienna won't take this well, Graham said quietly. Probably not, I agreed. But you're not running a charity. You're running a business that just took investment capital with specific conditions attached. Those conditions require operational maturity. If Sienna can evolve with the organization, great. If she can't, that's unfortunate, but necessary. The 6-month review meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I arrived early, taking a moment to appreciate the symbolism. 6 months ago, I had been the family disappointment at a birthday dinner. Today, I was about to require the dismantling of my cousin's professional empire as a condition of continued funding. The meeting began with Paige's operational assessment. She walked through the current state, the required future state, and the gap between them. Graham's leadership team listened in increasingly uncomfortable silence as the implications became clear. The reorganization needs to happen now, Paige concluded. Waiting just extends the timeline and increases risk. I recommend implementing the new team structure within the next 60 days and using the final 90 days for training and stabilization. That's too fast, Sienna protested. We can't completely reorganize while managing active client engagements. You'll have to, I said flatly, because if you don't complete the operational improvements by month 9, Meridian won't release the remaining funding. And without that funding, how long can Garrison Tech operate? The CFO had clearly run these numbers already. 4 months, maybe 5 if we cut costs aggressively. Then you have exactly one choice, I said. Restructure now and get the funding to support your growth, or stay in your current structure and run out of money. There is no third option. Graham looked at Sienna with something like regret. I need you to support this transition. Help us build the new team structure. Train the new team leads. Make this work. You're asking me to eliminate my own job, Sienna said, her voice tight. I'm asking you to evolve your job, Graham corrected. There will still be project management work, but it will be distributed across a team instead of concentrated in one person. At what level? She pressed. What's my role in this new structure? The silence that followed answered her question more clearly than words could. There wasn't a role for her at the same level. The reorganization would create 3 team lead positions, but they would be peers, not a single senior manager coordinating everything. Sienna stood abruptly. This is personal. This entire thing has been about punishing me from the beginning. This is business, I replied calmly. If you can't tell the difference, that explains a lot about why your operational model was never going to scale. She turned to Graham, desperation finally breaking through her professional composure. You're really going to let her do this? Destroy everything we've built because I hurt her feelings at a family dinner? Graham wouldn't meet her eyes. The operational improvements aren't optional, Sienna. They're conditions of our funding agreement. Then find different funding, she shouted. There are other investors, other firms that won't require us to build sustainable operations, I interrupted. Good luck finding professional investors who don't care about scalability and operational maturity. We're not imposing unusual requirements. We're imposing standard ones that you've managed to avoid until now. Sienna grabbed her bag and headed for the door. I can't be part of this. Graham, I'm taking a personal day. Call me when you decide what you're really prioritizing, your business or her vendetta. The door slammed behind her, leaving awkward silence in her wake. Well, the VP of engineering said finally, I guess we're implementing the reorganization. Graham rubbed his temples. How do we do this without losing her entirely? She does have legitimate expertise. You make it clear that she has 2 options, Paige said. Participate in the transition and potentially find a role in the new structure, or resign and pursue opportunities elsewhere. But you don't negotiate. You don't create special positions to preserve her status. You commit to the operational improvements fully. I added one final point. And Graham, you need to understand something. Sienna has been running to our family, to my mother, to anyone who will listen, claiming this is personal rather than professional. If she continues doing that, it creates liability for Meridian Ventures. We have documented business justifications for every decision we've made. If she tries to claim discrimination or retaliation, we're prepared to defend our position aggressively. Make sure she understands that. Graham nodded slowly. I'll have HR set up a formal meeting to discuss her options. The meeting ended with clear action items and timelines. Implementation of the new team structure would begin immediately. Sienna had 1 week to decide whether she would participate in the transition or resign. and Garrison Tech had 90 days to complete the reorganization and demonstrate sustainable operations worthy of the final funding tranche. I left the office knowing that Sienna's decision was already made, even if she didn't realize it yet. She couldn't participate in dismantling her own empire. Her identity was too wrapped up in being indispensable. When forced to choose between evolving and protecting her ego, she would choose ego every time. That evening, my phone exploded with messages. My mother, my aunt, even my grandmother, all demanding to know why I was destroying Sienna's career over a petty grudge. I ignored them all, focusing instead on documenting the day's events in my investment notes. 3 days later, Sienna's resignation letter arrived at Graham's office. She was taking a position with a competitor, she claimed, one that valued loyalty and expertise over arbitrary operational demands. She would work through a 2-week notice period to ensure appropriate knowledge transfer, though we all knew that transfer would be minimal and vindictive. Graham forwarded me the resignation letter with a single line. I assume this satisfies Meridian's requirements for reducing key person dependencies? I replied, it certainly helps. Proceed with the reorganization as planned. And just like that, Sienna's carefully constructed professional identity collapsed. The woman who had publicly humiliated me for leaving corporate stability to start a little business venture was now scrambling to find new employment because that little business venture had systematically dismantled her professional leverage. But I wasn't done yet. There was still one more move to make. Garrison Tech completed their operational reorganization in 87 days, 3 days ahead of the deadline. The new team structure functioned better than anyone had anticipated, largely because it turned out that several of Sienna's team members had been quietly frustrated by her centralizing tendencies for years. Once freed from the bottleneck of routing everything through her, they flourished. Paige's final report was glowing. Garrison Tech has transformed from a person-dependent operation to a system-dependent one. Client delivery is faster, quality is more consistent, and the team has capacity to scale. This is what sustainable operations look like. Meridian Ventures released the final tranche of funding. Graham sent a personal thank you note acknowledging that while the process had been painful, the results spoke for themselves. Garrison Tech's client acquisition accelerated. Revenue growth resumed. Within 6 months, they were fielding acquisition interest from larger software companies. I attended the final review meeting where Graham presented Garrison Tech's performance metrics to Meridian's investment committee. The numbers were impressive. 35% revenue growth, 15 new client contracts, 92% customer satisfaction scores. The operational improvements had unlocked exactly the scalability they needed. Any questions for Graham? I asked my partners after his presentation concluded. Callum leaned forward. What happened with Sienna? I heard she joined a competitor. Has that created any issues? Graham shook his head. Honestly, less than I expected. She took some tribal knowledge with her, but because we documented everything during the operational improvements, we were able to backfill her role more smoothly than if this had happened a year ago. If anything, her departure validated why the reorganization was necessary. After Graham left, Rowan turned to me with an appreciative smile. You played that perfectly. Professional, documented, completely defensible from a business perspective, but the personal satisfaction must be immense. It's not about satisfaction, I replied, though we all knew that was partly a lie. It's about building companies that can scale sustainably instead of depending on individual heroics. But privately, yes, there was satisfaction. Deep, complete satisfaction in watching Sienna's empire crumble because she had built it on sand rather than stone. 6 months after Garrison Tech's final funding tranche, the family gathered again for another occasion, my grandmother's 81st birthday. I debated whether to attend, but ultimately decided that absence would suggest weakness, and I wasn't weak anymore. The atmosphere was dramatically different from the previous year. I arrived in a Tesla Model S, a professional achievement I had deliberately delayed purchasing until the timing was right. I wore a custom suit from the same designer Sienna used to favor, the one she could no longer afford after taking a lateral move to a smaller company at reduced salary. My parents greeted me warmly, though there was awkwardness beneath the surface. They knew what had happened, even if the full details remained murky. Aunt Vera was notably cooler, having apparently chosen sides in a conflict she didn't fully understand. Sienna arrived late, alone. I noticed immediately that she had traded her usual designer wardrobe for something more modest. Her confidence, that assured certainty that used to radiate from her, had been replaced by something harder and more brittle. We made it through appetizers and salad before the inevitable confrontation. "So, Ivy?" Aunt Vera said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Sienna mentioned you were involved in some business dealings with her former company. Such a small world." "Not that small," I replied pleasantly. "Venture capital is my profession. We review hundreds of investment opportunities each year. Garrison Tech was one of them." "And you just happened to impose requirements that forced her out of her job?" Vera continued. "What an unfortunate coincidence." "The requirements were standard operational due diligence," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. "Any serious investor would have required similar improvements before deploying capital into a company with such concentrated key person dependencies." Sienna set down her fork with deliberate precision. "You destroyed my career to get revenge for one dinner comment. Everyone here knows it." "I didn't destroy your career," I replied calmly. "I required a company seeking $2 million in investment to build sustainable operations. You chose to resign rather than adapt to that new structure. Those were your decisions, not mine. You systematically dismantled everything I'd built." "Everything you'd built was a bottleneck that prevented scaling," I interrupted. "Garrison Tech's revenue growth since your departure confirms that. They've grown faster with distributed operations than they ever did with you as the central dependency point." The table had gone silent, everyone watching this confrontation with the fascination of spectators at a car crash. "You're really going to sit there and pretend this was purely professional?" Sienna demanded. "After what you did to my career, my reputation." "After what I did?" I set down my own fork, my patience finally exhausted. "Sienna, you called me the family disappointment at this exact table 1 year ago. You publicly mocked my career choice in front of our entire extended family. You questioned my judgment, my competence, my future prospects. You did all of that deliberately to elevate yourself at my expense." I looked around the table, making eye contact with each family member. "How many of you said something in my defense that night? How many of you told Sienna she was out of line? How many of you stood up for me?" Silence. "That's what I thought," I continued. "So when Sienna's employer came to my firm seeking investment, I evaluated their application using the same professional standards I apply to every company. The fact that those standards exposed operational weaknesses built around Sienna's working style isn't revenge, it's just business." "You could have recused yourself," Sienna insisted. "If this was really just business, you would have let your partners handle it." "Why would I recuse myself from a professionally appropriate transaction just because my cousin works for the company?" I countered. "That would have been poor stewardship of my fiduciary responsibilities to our limited partners. I'm not obligated to give preferential treatment to family members any more than I'm obligated to accept abuse from them." My mother finally spoke up. "Can we please not do this at Grandma's birthday party?" "You're right," I said, standing. "I should leave, but before I go, I want to make one thing clear." I looked directly at Sienna. "You built your professional reputation on being irreplaceable. You measured your worth by how much people needed you, not by how much value you created. When faced with requirements to document and systematize your knowledge, you chose to protect your monopoly rather than serve your company's interests. That's not my failure as an investor. It's yours as an employee." I gathered my purse and coat. "Grandma, happy birthday. I left your gift on the table in the foyer." As I walked out, I heard Aunt Vera saying something about my arrogance, about how success had gone to my head. I didn't turn around. Their opinions no longer mattered. I had proven something to myself that was far more important than proving anything to them. 3 months later, I received an email from a recruiter. One of Garrison Tech's acquiring companies was looking for an executive to lead their operational integration. Would I be interested in joining as Chief Operating Officer? I declined politely, but forwarded the opportunity to Paige, who was ready for her next challenge. She got the position and has since become one of my closest professional allies. Garrison Tech itself was acquired 14 months after the final funding tranche, providing Meridian Ventures with a 4.7x return on our investment. Our limited partners were thrilled. Our reputation in the venture capital community strengthened considerably, and I became known as someone who could identify operational risks that other investors missed. Today, I run Meridian Ventures as managing partner after Callum retired to pursue teaching. We've deployed over $200 million across 37 companies. Our operational diligence framework, the one I first developed for the Garrison Tech investment, has become our signature approach, copied by other firms but never quite replicated. Sienna works as a project management consultant now, moving between short-term contracts at companies that need temporary expertise. Her LinkedIn profile describes her as a transformation specialist, which is true in a way she didn't intend. She certainly transformed my understanding of how family dynamics and professional relationships intersect. We don't speak. At family gatherings, the few I still attend, we maintain careful distance, orbiting each other like celestial bodies held apart by gravitational forces too powerful to overcome. My mother occasionally suggests that enough time has passed, that we should try to reconcile, that family is more important than old grudges. I listen politely and change the subject. Because this was never about grudges. It was about understanding that respect isn't freely given based on blood relation. It's earned through behavior, demonstrated through action, and withdrawn when violated. Sienna called me the family disappointment while passing the mashed potatoes. She measured my worth by her own narrow metrics and found me wanting. What she didn't realize was that her metrics were meaningless in the domain where I had built actual power. The irony is perfect. She destroyed her own career trying to diminish mine. She lost everything while attempting to prove I had nothing. And she did it all in pursuit of a type of success that was obsolete before she even recognized it was ending. Some people learn from their mistakes. Others spend their lives insisting they were right even as the evidence of their wrongness compounds around them. I know which one I am, and I sleep very well at night.